The drag queens were, for Warhol, the epitome of the glamorous Hollywood stars he'd always adored, and the most beautiful of them all was Candy Darling.
We're going to invite the chicest, richest, prettiest, youngest pigs in Manhattan.
Why, Candy Darling, what are you doing in this place? Get up and get dressed and out of here. Oh, who are you? You disgusting lowlife. What's this organization you're involved in? Pigs. Well, you're not a pig. You're a darling. And put your head high and proud when you say that you're not anti-American.
PIG stands for politically involved girls.
Well, you get politically involved at home where you belong. You're a darling, Candy. And you're going to stay a darling. Now get dressed and ready and come with me. And you can go piss up a rope. My sister.
Candy Darling was certainly the most outstanding of the drag queens because she was really so beautiful that most people didn't know it was a man. And then, of course, she died as a result of it. She died as a result of taking some of the drugs or shots she took in her approach to having a sex change operation, which she got to in the last years of her life. So I think that Andy loved her very much for giving up her life for what she wanted to be.
Incest, lesbianism. I'm ready for Hollywood, right, Johnny?
I think in the 70s, Andy became an enigma because he became increasingly famous and more people didn't know what he did. And he encouraged this by saying in interviews that he didn't do anything. One of the great interviews he gave once was to a very serious class at UCLA in California, and it was a film class. And they said, well, Mr. Warhol, what do you do in your films? We don't quite understand. You don't direct them, you don't act them. He said, I just go to the parties.
In the 70s, Andy wanted things to be quieter. He wanted things to be less threatening. The factory was, for us, the office. We never called it the factory. Andy called it the office, we called it the office. His career also changed. He became much more involved with commissioned portraits, which therefore meant that his social life was much more involved with rich people. And so it was a much more conservative period. I met Andy Warhol in 1970, and I started writing some reviews for Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. And one day I went to hand my review in, and there was Andy. He was going through his mail. And the way he went through his mail was he would hold each letter like practically up to his face like this. He always looked at things almost like a diamond dealer looking at a stone. And I don't know, who knows why, what he was looking for. I don't know, the quality of the paper, but he always analyzed things very closely. And then he would rip off the stamp of every letter, the cancel stamp, and throw that in a box, which I later learned was his stamp collection. And then he would, if it was a check, he would put that in a pile. If it was a bill, he'd put it in another pile. And anything else, press releases, free records from record companies, fan mail, hate mail, whatever, would go in another box. And that was called the time capsule. And these time capsules, there must be 1,000 of them, each one representing maybe 2 or 3 months in Andy's life, Andy's mail. And he also simultaneously was having some lunch, which consisted of vegetable purees from Brownie's health food restaurant. And he said, oh, hi. And I said, I'm Bob Colacello. I'm writing some reviews, and the editors. Oh, yeah, hi. I love the way you write, and would you like some of my vegetable puree? Interview magazine, when I took over in 1971, I became editor about 6 months after I met them, was a little underground rag, really. It was almost exclusively concerned with film, in particular underground film and European film, Godard, Bertolucci, etc. Gradually, we expanded it into fashion, into Hollywood movies, into everything. Authors, socialites, senators, everything.
Andy's career became extremely controversial politically again in the second half of the 70s because through his portrait paintings and his interview magazine, which had become pretty right-wing, he really associated himself very publicly with a number of right-wing people, most extremely dictators, the Shah of Iran and the Marcoses.
We never interviewed Imelda Marcos either. Yes, later, after I left, Imelda Marcos was interviewed. Again, wife of a chief of state. I would like to interview, you know, the president of Brazil, the president of Zimbabwe, the president of Czechoslovakia. I mean, I think these people, particularly the way we did it.
I think Andy would be a better president than Nixon.
I sure would.
He's going to be ready for office.
Would you accept a political position if you were drafted, Mr. Warhol?
Well, first thing I would do is I'd put carpets in the streets.
Why?
And then, well, I think it's nice to have carpets in the street.
And Andy always would say things like, well, if it wasn't for welfare, my family wouldn't have made it through the Depression.
What else would you change?
Money for everybody.
Andy was a liberal. We would fight about politics. That wouldn't stop him from interviewing Nancy Reagan, and why should it stop any? He was a good journalist.
The worst side of Andy, and the reason that I did not see him at all for the year before his death, was over the question of the Reagans, whom, of course, I abominate. And Andy was very close to the Reagans. Nancy Reagan was on the cover of Interview magazine, but it was right before the '84 election, I think. It's an American disease to love famous people, and Andy just shared in that disease. Andy wasn't unique in everything. He was a very good artist, but for the rest, he had, you know, problems like the rest of us. I mean, that's why he loved wretched people who owned big nightclubs. He loved those entrances.
Andy Warhol looks and scream, hanging on my wall. Andy Warhol, silver screen, can't tell them apart at all.
He was the ultimate social climber, as I said before, but his social climbing was more towards celebrityhood. I mean, he came from a completely immigrant background, and it was a real working class family. To Andy, fame was like royalty is to the Europeans or the South Americans. They're very big on royalty. And that was his social climbing, fame. He was really completely intoxicated with the idea of fame, famous people, anybody who was famous. He never turned down an invitation or an interview, ever. He would give an interview to the dog if he could talk.
What was the last exciting thing that happened to you?
You know, we would say, oh, Andy, why do you have this creep around? Well, this person is useless or hopeless, or, oh, no, they're fascinating, Bob. I mean, maybe they think you're useless, you know? I mean, it was, and I think that's more Catholic than just Christian, because there is this tradition in Catholicism of not judging, you know, which is different, let's say, than Southern Baptist or Calvinist, or I think it also affected his work in that Catholics have a feeling for pomp and ceremony, and Andy loved that. You know, he was fascinated by power and money, and that's the other side of the Catholic Church, this you know, let's face it, the world's longest running power organization.
Most of the people that Andy surrounded himself with in the latter part of his life were people that never really contributed anything to his artwork in terms of ideas or inspiration or anything for that matter. It was the early paintings, it was the period from 1962 to 1970, let's say, even shortly after he was shot. He was involved with people who did contribute in a very major and substantial and viable way to the creation of his art. And I think his art suffered because of it later on. He became like a court painter in a sense.
He came back from Germany and he called me up and he said, oh, Dee, I just painted 50 portraits. I said, who the hell did you paint? He said, 50 German industrialists and businessmen. I said, that's terrible, Andy. How much did you get? He said, 50,000 each. Unless they had a wife or a child, in that case, 75,000. So, you know, you do the quick arithmetic. It's a lot of bread. And it was done in 2 months, and it was done with a Polaroid. Those he never controlled. He took the Polaroid, he gave it to the boys in the on Broadway. They took it to the house that made the blow up, and they put the paint on, and then he would look at it. He would okay it. He'd say, no, the paint's wrong, do this. But he wasn't involved in it at all.
It's my own feeling that every artist, you know, has peaks and valleys, right, and slumps, and you're hot for X amount of years, 15 minutes or whatever, and then you have to think of something to do to pay the rent. And Andy was, I think that what I think was most brilliant about Andy really was that he devised a way to pay the rent.
I'm a commercial person.
Why?
Well, I've got a lot of mouths to feed. Got to bring home the bacon.
Listen, Andy, really, listen. We gotta make the bread and butter. Who's gonna bring home the bacon? You know, how are we gonna pay the rent here? You know? I mean, that was the reason for the portraits.
And I always used to say to Andy, you should charge people for the portrait and then add another fee for plastic surgery. Because, you know, as you can see from my portrait, they're very, very flattering. And Andy didn't like me in glasses, so there were no glasses, you know, I mean, and then he would make the nose straighter and snip out the double chin. And
there'd always be X amount of portraits to do, and that was like work. And then when we were in the think tank together, he would say, but what could we do for art? What kind of art could we do? Andy never really talked very much about art. He did it, you know, he was a doer. And so he would say, oh, Ronnie, what's new? You know, do you have any ideas? Oh, I can't think of anything this week. Well, everybody sort of wants to be what they're not. He wanted to be an abstract artist. It was always in the back of his mind, and he would always try and think of how he could be abstract. He always liked the shadows in his paintings. He had gone to Paris, and Andy always went antiquing, and he found a beautiful skull, and he bought it, and he came back from Paris, and he handed it to me, and he said, take some photographs of this, let's do some skull paintings. When I photographed it, what happened was the shadow that it cast made the head of a baby. It became a very interesting painting.
Aka, Midori, Ao, Gunjoiro, Kyodei.
Always seeking greater celebrity, in the 80s Warhol began experimenting with one of his greatest loves, television.
But I think, you know, with the MTV show, we did 5 shows all together with him. Our ratings were up every show, and there was a direction going there. And he was getting better and better on camera as the host, main host, and, you know, Jerry Hall and Debbie Harry and people like that working with. He was really behind it. And he financed all the TV shows, none of which at this point have made any money for him. But he believed in it, and, you know, and we did 3 little 60-second spots for Saturday Night Live. Every year they asked Andy to do, you know, to be the host.
In the first place, I never thought I'd ever be on Saturday Night Live because I hate the show. And I never watched it. I never thought it was that great. And then if you're home on a Saturday night, why are you home on a Saturday night?
Yeah, really, we're waiting for you.
In the 80s, Warhol seemed to rediscover the youth culture that he'd been in love with 20 years earlier. The original factory had always been a hangout for musicians, and it was there that Warhol had discovered and produced the legendary Velvet Underground. Throughout the years, rock stars continued to come to Warhol's studio, attracted by his celebrity and his enthusiasm for their projects. But in the 80s, Warhol became actively involved with music again when he began producing pop videos.
The Curiosity Kids, Andy liked a lot. He came back from London and said, listen, the manager's going to call you up, let's do the tape. I don't care how little the budget will be, let's just do it.
Crazy sheep, you want the odd one out. Crazy sheep, let them know what you're all about. This big crickets on the street. Well, I can see sorrow in your eyes. How high can you go? There'll be a price for every time you see.
The 80s for Andy, I believe, was recapturing of his youth of the 60s, because the 80s, the first part of the 80s became very much like the 60s, and there was various artists like myself and John Michel and Keith Haring who had sort of stirred that up again, and Andy was very lively about that. I remember him saying, "Oh my God, this is like the 60s again, this is fun." There were more like art became the rock and roll of the 80s.
Andy Warhol is a scream, hang him on your wall.
So openings were really glamorous and fun, and people went there to fall in love and to look at art and to meet each other. It was the basic social hub.
He didn't go out there and start, walk into galleries and say, "Boy, I want to start talking to these young artists." They kind of came to him. With John Michel Basquiat, they started painting together, and Clemente came in on a project. So it was Clemente and Jean Michel and Andy painting, and then this Jean Michel and Andy. And that was a very kind of creative period for Andy because he got back to the brush. Number of paintings with Jean Michel, which became a show. They had something really going there where they would paint at different times. They'd put the paintings up on the wall. He would paint, and then Jean Michel would come in later and start painting on top of that.
John Russell said that Andy was the greatest colorist since Matisse, and that he was in particular the great colorist of acrylic painting. And that on the surface his colors seemed neon, lavender and pink and orange and green, bright green, but there was always black in every color. And it was true. Underneath it all, there's blackness. Andy was very aware of death all the time.
The feel of the show is so deathly. There's always been death in his work, suicides, disasters, and so on. But this has a terrible melancholy about it. A feeling of introspection, of looking backwards. And the one thing I kept thinking about was the relationship of this to, the great late self-portraits, people like, one doesn't dare say it, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, as we pronounce them in the States, a kind of moodiness, a kind of inwardness, a kind of darkness, a kind of loneliness, and this is a whole new world for Andy, and it suddenly clicks into place with a whole history of tragic late self-portraiture.
Andy Warhol died in hospital the day after a gallbladder operation. He was 58. At the time of his death, he lived alone in the house he'd once shared with his mother.
I heard about his death because his doctor called me, about 6:30, 6:45 in the morning that Sunday. And I was told, which was a, major surprise, to say the least. Because when I saw him Saturday afternoon in the hospital, he was fine.
Oh, yes, I'm the great pretender. Just like a crown, pretend that you're still around.
The souls of the just are in the hand of God, and no torment shall touch them. They seemed in the view of the foolish to be dead, and their passing away was thought an affliction, and their going forth from us utter destruction. But they are in peace. I think everything has a beginning and everything has an end. And just like we're all sitting here right now, this kind of thing can't keep going on about Andy because now it's really finished.
Well, the future of Andy Warhol Studio is that right now we're the estate of Andy Warhol, which is so odd sounding, and we're in transition to become a foundation for the visual arts. Through Andy's name, even though he's not with us anymore, he was able to help people through giving money away every year. So it's kind of that, in a sense, it's very positive.
He encouraged us very much to see our lives as movies and to star in them and to direct them, i.e., take control of your life.
How long have you been working here now?
Well, I started here in February, so I guess that makes it about 4 months now.
So how did you get hired?
Well, a friend of mine, Chris Marcos, introduced me to Andy back in October, and from there, Chris convinced Andy that I should work for him as his assistant.